Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm so happy to be joined today by Dr. Pearl Sumathi, who is a strategic, consultative, and hands-on leader, trusted C-suite advisor, and industry thought leader. With 20 plus years of global HR experience that has measurable business impact, she has established and led learning functions at Lincoln Financial, received international awards for best-in-class learning programs and exemplary learning leadership at Lincoln Financial. She's also been on the faculty of Wharton and is currently the assistant professor of practice at Oklahoma State University. Welcome to the program, Pearl.
Thank you, Charles, for the introduction.
Before we get started, I always like to ask our guests kind of a little bit about their background, what got you interested in this space, and especially in this topic of accountability, which will be the focus of this episode.
So, I've been in the learning and development space, Charles, for more than a decade, and I've been in human resources for close to 25 years. And my passion is very high on education and training leaders on core skills that are needed to make them successful has been my mission. And having said that, I feel accountability is a very critical topic and a skill set that can help leaders to enhance their leadership capabilities.
Well, that's great. And I would agree. It's something that's everyone needs to be reminded of. And that skill really needs to be strengthened in this day and age with many new and emerging leaders, as well as those leaders that are in place in various organizations. Why do you think accountability is really so important to an organization?
So let me start with a big picture before I come to the specific answer to your question. Businesses are getting disrupted, right, on a continual basis, as you can see. 2 years back, we spoke about COVID, and now we're talking about AI and ChatGPT. So there is something or the other disrupting businesses. So when businesses disrupt, certain things continue to evolve. Specifically, the leadership skill sets that are needed for our leaders continues to evolve. And accountability, as I have seen, continues to gain prime importance regardless of what disruption is happening. And experts say we will not go back to the normal. We are going back to a new normal. And I feel the new normal calls for very specialized leadership skill sets. And accountability is one of the key skill sets that leaders need to manage people more effectively. And I think one of the biggest differentiator between successful and unsuccessful teams is accountability. So is your team able to be accountable? That translates into the success of the teams.
Very well said. If accountability is so critical, why do you think people shy away from accountability conversations?
Great question. As humans, we tend to avoid unpleasant conversations. We do not want to get into conflict. So, having said that, there are some managers and leaders who are very good in having those conversations. And if you're a people leader, one can understand what I'm saying. Having an accountability conversation is not easy because you're getting into very sensitive areas about where the person potentially failed or where they need to improve on. So the reactions from the other side can be anything. And you need to have the maturity to handle that conversation, the expertise to handle and steer the conversation in the right way so that the two parties walk away right on a good note and a more progressive note. And communication skills are very essential. And I think accountability conversations, having good conversation doesn't come on day one. It's with practice, intentional application of skill sets, those conversations can become more productive.
Is there one tip that you can give leaders that would help them having these types of conversations, especially if they're a new and emerging leader and they haven't had experience with these types of conversations? Because I know for me, a lot of them, what I see personally as well as professionally with friends, with colleagues, is that they just don't want to have them. They just would prefer not to go down that road and hope that the issue resolves itself.
I think gaining some expertise, right, on how other seasoned leaders are having these conversations can help. It could be reading great books on accountability or attending a course that can help you build those skills are essential. And I think when you are really beginning to practice this, expecting teams to be accountable is one side of the story. But before that expectation sets in, you need to role model accountability. You need to know as an individual, whether you're a new leader or a seasoned leader, how do I exhibit accountability as an individual? And that's important. And one of my favorite quotes is from Gandhi, who said, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." So you need to bring that change and that behavior in you. And when you start doing that as a leader, what happens is that you begin to build peer accountability within your team. The second thing that I would challenge the audience is to think about, can you give yourself the permission to be vulnerable? And you may wonder why we're talking about the vulnerability when you're talking about accountability. And I will come to that point in a bit. Being vulnerable doesn't mean, right, you're trying to say that I'm a failure, all right, or I've got some weakness. Being vulnerable is that you're boldly proclaiming the real person that you are. And when you show your vulnerability, I think teams start to respect you as a leader. And also, you are encouraging your teams to be vulnerable. And I'm a strong believer in this. And because I have not, as a leader, practiced vulnerability in my career, I always thought as a leader, I'm supposed to be, a person who knows everything. I should not show that I'm agitated. But with experience, I have learned that showing that you're human is okay, right? Bringing that humanness into leadership is very critical. We're talking so much about empathy. And that empathy comes, right, as a result of bringing the human in you into the relationship and giving your team permission, right, to even exhibit their failures and their shortcomings can just help the person to build more ownership into the tasks that they are doing.
Well, I agree. And what I heard you saying is really accountability starts with a leader before they can expect their team to be accountable. And really, you have to foster that trust and psychological safety before you really have these conversations so that they have the impact that you're hoping for. Otherwise, you're not building it on a solid foundation.
Absolutely. I think you used a great term, psychological safety. Absolutely.
So, how can leaders begin to hold their teams accountable? Or maybe we could go by just what's one thing that leaders could do to build more personal accountability? And then maybe you could expand upon how they can begin to hold their teams accountable as well.
And it's a two-way process, as you said, right? It comes from the leader and then it comes from the teams that they are managing. And I think the first thing that I'm a big fan of is build that big picture, right? Help your employees understand the bigger purpose for which they're working towards. Understanding that vision and the mission towards which they're working is very important to get them excited, right, about the work that they're doing as an individual. And secondly, is about setting very clear expectations. Now, as a leader, when you're giving a task or a project to your team, it is only fair that you explain to them what you feel the end product should look like, right? If you don't have too much clarity on what the end product should look like, at least making every effort to give them as much details as possible on what is in your mind, right? From an initial idea. It can be an initial idea, or it could be, or this is what I'm expecting, right? The final product or the outcome to be. And that helps your team to understand what the expectations are. Because if you think about accountability, right, the formula is very simple. So there is an expectation and there is a deliverable, right? When the deliverable does not align with the expectation, that's when accountability issues arises. That's when gaps and tensions begin to arise. So as a leader, I think it is everyone's responsibility, or as a manager, to bridge this gap between the expectation and deliverable as much as possible. And I would also say, as an employee, right, when you're taking on a task from your manager, or from a key stakeholder, asking questions. Sometimes, in my experience, I've seen some people feel, all right, if I'm going to ask follow up questions, that could show I'm not an expert in my area. That could show that I cannot do the project well. But I think it's the contrary. The more productive questions you ask, the more great deliverables, right, and prompt deliverables you'll be able to give at the end.
Thank you. Let's move back, or let's look at the cost side of it now. What happens if there is a lack of accountability at work? What are some of those explicit, tangible costs? What are some of the implicit costs that are associated with this issue, and especially if it becomes more pervasive in the workplace?
I think the answer is simple: failed deliverables, right? When someone is not accountable, they are going to be failing the deliverables and they're not meeting expectations. And as a leader or a manager, you need to sense when that happens. When you feel that your team is consistently missing a deadline or they are not delivering things on time, then it's high time that as a manager, you backtrack and have more productive conversations to reset expectations or to see whether they are struggling with something and getting things lined up so that your team is progressing the way they're supposed to be progressing. But I think when a team fails, an organization fails. So I think it's a ripple effect. So the sooner we get to the root cause of the problem, the sooner you can correct the situation.
The other area really that is difficult sometimes for people to wrap their head around is really, how do you show accountability at work? What are some of the actions or behaviors that would show everyone that you're an accountable person, right? Or you're a boss that holds your team accountable?
So another great question. And I think I could answer it from two angles. One is I would talk about the individual accountability, and the second is about the team accountability. So let me start with the individual accountability. The individual accountability is all right, you have given me a task or a project, and how am I going to deliver this task or project? So it could mean like committing to a deadline, a realistic deadline that is possible. Sometimes because a manager pushes you to commit to a deadline, we say yes. And later we come back and say, I'm sorry, I'm not able to meet the deadline. And I've seen that in numerous instances in my experience. So when you're committing to a deadline, be comfortable that you're able to do that. You have the right resources, the knowledge, and the tools to do that. And also giving progressive updates. Sometimes you're not asked to give an update on how you're progressing with a project. But as a manager, I have appreciated a direct who got back to me and said, all right, we're not yet to the deadline, but I just want to keep you posted on how the project is progressing. And even if you're not required to do that, taking the initiative, being proactive and giving those updates really shows that you're owning up to the task. And let's talk about the team accountability, right? The team accountability is what, all right, I have done my task, but here is another member, right, in my team who's struggling to fulfill their task. Could I just give a lending hand? They have a sick child and they're not able to really do the project in a timely manner. Could I just stay back a little late, or could I just take a little bit load from their plate and help them? So that is you're looking out for your team. And I feel accountability should be team driven, right? Each one is accountable at the same time. Are you able to hold each other accountable? And are you able to ensure the success for the entire team versus just looking out for yourself? And that's a culture, right? So I think leaders building that culture of accountability can really increase the high performing nature of their teams.
Yeah, and I've seen this too so often when it doesn't happen in the workplace, like what you mentioned with, there's missed expectations, low trust levels, low team morale, poor performance, low job satisfaction, high employee turnover. So really, when there's a lack of accountability at work, there's a lot of issues that's going to pervade throughout the organization and cause a myriad of issues. So dealing with it and being more proactive with it is so critical and essential in order for it to for you to have an accountable workforce that really produces results. What are some of the ways that employees can improve their accountability?
I'd like to reiterate the point is about asking clarifying questions, right? A goal is given, but are you able to break the goals and ask your manager, what does success look like? Okay. How do you think that I have done a good job in giving this deliverable to you? Using your one on ones to discuss on how you're progressing with your goals can make accountability a year-long driven process versus, okay, let me sit and during performance review and tell you where you failed me and where you lost your accountability. I think that's not fair to the employee, right? When these conversations are had at the end of the year as part of the annual performance review cycle, kind of having these ongoing conversations and using your one-on-ones more productively, right, to stay on the goal, to have the conversations to ensure that they're progressing the way they are doing is the utmost responsibility of the leader as well as an employee. It's your responsibility to have those proactive conversations with your manager.
Definitely. And one of the areas of accountability that seems to be an issue for a lot of leaders is just being able to listen and take critical feedback, because people become very defensive. If it's not given the right way, then they shut down fairly quickly. Is there a better way for a leader, for a manager to give feedback to an employee so they become more accountable, they take action, they're more receptive to it?
Yes, and this is something, I have learned with my experience, right, on how to give good feedback. And I'm sure many managers can echo with me that giving good feedback, so that you're walking away with a good feeling, right, after a tough conversation. And as I said, it's not easy, right? It comes with practice. And I think as managers, being focused, right, on the behavior is important, right? What behavior are you trying to address? Are you able to get into the specifics of where you felt the employee failed in delivering the desired behavior versus saying you fail on your deliverables all the time? Versus picking up a specific example to say how you define deliverable, how you define the failure, right? Where did they fail and how did they fail? And how did your team get affected or your deliverables as a manager gets affected as a result of them failing that deliverable? Kind of going into those specifics and just being focused on their behavior versus getting very subjective, right, in commenting is important. There are tools that can help managers to do that, and generally courses on accountability discuss those tools so that you're able to put them into action.
And some of it's just experience, having experience and having those conversations, making sure that you're not assassinating the character of the person, but you're, like you said, you're targeting the behavior and focusing on that so that there's less defensiveness on the part of the person you're speaking to. The other issue that I see a lot around this topic is really people have a lack of ownership of over their actions. They want to blame someone else. They want to play the victim. Is there any tips that you can give those leaders in trying to make people take more ownership over their actions? When it's a failure, it's a learning opportunity. When it's a success, people don't usually have issues with that, but that ownership piece is really critical, and many people don't want to take ownership if it's a bad outcome.
I think it goes back to the culture of the organization because oftentimes, when you are risk averse or when you are failure averse, employees tend, it's easy for someone to say, all right, I was successful, yes, I did a great job, right? I failed, that no one says I failed, but rather you try to find reasons for why that failure occurred. And that goes back to my earlier conversation, right? Kind of building that culture gradually within your teams. I understand every organization, depending on what business they are, there's only so much risks you can take, right? Some organizations are very risk averse, and that is very valid. But what is the extent of risk you can take, and what is the extent of failure you can tolerate? And those criteria has to be clarified very well to the team so that people know the parameters within which they are operating. And as I said, as a leader, when you say, I think I did not make a good judgment call on this, that means you are role modeling and telling them, I failed as a leader. And when you do that, then the directs automatically get that confidence to express when they feel that they have failed something or they fumbled on a deliverable. And I think in that way, you are able to encourage them not only to own up to the successes, but to own up to the failures. And one of the my principles has always been, right? It's okay to fail. It's okay to fail. But what is that you're going to do to ensure you don't repeat that failure again? And I have worked for several managers, and I can think of few managers who have always assured me, right, that it's okay to fail. I'll hold you back, and then those words really strengthen you as a person and gives you that freedom, a little bit of freedom, right, to play a little bit around and give you the braveness to come and say, yes, I failed, because you know that your manager is holding you back. I think all those things are very interconnected dots, Charles, and kind of, intentionally creating that safe environment within your teams will help them own up to the failures more easily.
Exactly. The culture is so important. And I love what you said regarding, the leader needs to model the behavior they want from their colleagues, from their subordinates, so that it's easier for them to exhibit that behavior or the desired behaviors that the leader is hoping for. How important is having an accountability partner? There's been a lot of talk about this, many articles keep coming out about it, of having a support network, especially accountability partners to help them through the process.
I'm thinking about what Dr. Adam Brandt, at Wharton, he's a professor, I had the privilege to work with him. And he talks about that network, right? That safety network that you need to build. And this network need not necessarily be people who praise you all the time, right? Think about people whom you don't want to have a conversation with them because they always critique your behavior. And having a mixture of those type of people is important because they can point to your mistakes more easily, right, than someone who's very close to you. For example, your spouse, right, can give you very blatant feedback about who you are versus another peer, right, who can hesitate to give you feedback. So, kind of having a blend of that network is important to keep you grounded and to make you a little more clearer on how you are as a leader from an accountability perspective. So getting feedback from those type of network can really help build you as a leader from an accountability perspective, but also as employees, working in a team, having those trusted partners, right, where you can just have this conversation, right? I feel I failed on this deliverable. Do you see reasons why I could have not done this on time? Having that confidential discussions and having that peer network or an internal coach, right, who can give you that advice is really imperative and vital.
That's great information. With accountability, perhaps more than some other soft skill development topics for leaders, they have a lot of different principles, techniques. They have the 6 steps, the 3 habits. I mean, everyone has their own take on it. The one that I've heard a lot is the 5 W's of accountability, because it's difficult to be accountable if you aren't clear on what we talked about earlier, your expectations. So those 5 W's provide clarity around your priorities of the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Are there other tips that you can give just to help an individual if they really want to get clear on what their expectations are, what they're being held accountable for, that they can kind of use as a reference when they're talking to the leader, to the boss, to say, I'm still not clear on this, but it seems not to be connecting with the boss. So is there a framework or a structure that, besides, or maybe it's the 5 W's, that's an effective one to get clarity on those expectations?
I would go back, to the goal clarity. One, how is success going to be measured when I complete doing this? And leaders, they also have to add a third step is how am I going to celebrate your success? So showing the end result from the beginning to the person helps them get on track. And I think it begins with setting expectations and goal. If your manager is not giving you enough information, then take the time to ask good questions, take the time to have multiple conversations, or go and meet other stakeholders who have worked with the person so that they understand their style of working and their levels of working. And then you should, as an individual, you should know, right? When I complete the task, what is a yardstick? How are you going to measure whether I was successful or a failure in the task? And then celebrating success is something many people don't take the time, especially your execution focus. You tend to go on to the next task. But if you're a leader, right, trying to have this set framework within your team, all right, this is how we go about doing a task, but this is how we go about celebrating our victories and wins, then what happens is that, you almost know, all right, this is the motion or the iteration we will go through, and the person knows from beginning to end, this is what to expect, right? As you're working towards the deliverable and completing it.
That's good information because, it's creating those SMART goals. I know everyone's heard of SMART goals, but getting that clarity around those, as well as those expectations, you're right, making sure those are crystal clear for the individual. The other thing that I've heard from other leaders is accountability is really also the act of being able to say no to certain things. Would you agree with that? Because a lot of people, especially when they come into leadership ranks, they want to say yes to everything. They want everyone to see their value. They want to take on as much as possible to showcase their skills and expertise.
Yes, I would say yes and no to that. Yes, you as a leader, you should know when to say no. But at the same time, right, if you are trying to build innovation, right, within your team, sometimes a premature no can also stifle, right, the ability for your teams to innovate on something. Oftentimes, we say no to things we feel are impossible, right? So sometimes, as a leader, you should know, right, when to put your guardrails, but when to take out certain things you feel you're not sure of. Oftentimes, we say no to things we feel, oh, I have no idea how I'm going to get to it, so I'm going to say no to it, right? So before you say no, it's okay to say no, but before you say no, think about, right, the opportunities you might refuse, right, to try. Had you tried, probably, you could have allowed your team to be a little more innovative and creative in what they do. Probably you can come up with a product or a service, right, that could evolve your organization. So kind of sometimes our no's often comes with constraints, but seeing constraints as opportunities for innovation can also help you in the process.
And getting back to kind of what you said prior to that regarding celebrations, it's so important to celebrate when they're exhibiting the right behaviors to encourage that and foster that moving forward. But I see a lot of times organizations and leaders try to take accountability from zero. I mean, they come into an organization maybe where there's some accountability issues and they want to institute a very strict policy regarding it or try to encourage it at a very rapid pace. Are you an advocate of a little accountability can go a long way to build it gradually over time, or do you think it should be done on a more rapid pace if they're finding some of these issues that are pervasive throughout their organization?
So, as I said, it's a culture you're building, and a culture cannot be done aggressively. A culture builds on very gradually, and you need to take small steps. And as a leader, right, there are some big moments you want to celebrate, and yes, you want to be aggressive on certain things. But we should not also forget that there are some small moments, right, that you need to stop and celebrate. And today I was watching an interview, by one of a top CEO of a pharmaceutical company, and he said, yes, leadership is about big moments, but leadership is also about some small moments you're spending within your team. So kind of, taking some baby steps when you have to, and then gradually building and accelerating, right, the process of accountability works. That's my personal take, right? Kind of doing it on day one. This is how I'm going to hold you all accountable may not go too far in my experience because people want to be a part of the journey. And when you want them to be a part of the journey, you need to include them, right, in everything that you do at their own pace.
And also be realistic, right? No one is perfect. Be realistic about setting goals, expectations, and assigning tasks. Well, thank you so much, Pearl, for being on this episode. Really enjoyed the conversation. I know our listeners will as well. Any final tip if leaders could do one thing to become more personally accountable, maybe hold their teams accountable? Is there one thing that you would recommend them doing?
I would say it starts with you as a leader. So, what can you do as a leader to show that you're accountable? And then the energy spreads after that.
So, Pearl, before we end this episode, remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn as Pearl Sumathi, and be free to approach me if you have any other questions.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.